We all know how tricky it can be for even one big company, to pivot fast in a crisis.
Absolutely.
But what happens when that organization is really a bunch of other organizations?
Uh-huh.
Can these supergroups actually step up when things get really tough really fast?
That's a huge question, and it's exactly what we're digging into today.
Okay.
We're talking about what researchers call meta-organizations. Basically, organizations whose members are, well, other organizations.
Okay, like a trade association.
Exactly. Think of the American Chamber of Commerce or maybe the European Banking Federation.
Got it.
And on a bigger scale, you've got bodies like the European Union, maybe even the WHO or 8A, the Air Transport Association.
Right. And membership is often voluntary, isn't it? That seems key.
It often is, yeah. That voluntary nature is a big factor.
So we had a listener ask something really relevant here. How well do these meta-organizations actually work, especially the ones with governments involved, when, bam, a crisis hits and they need to act together, like yesterday?
It's a fantastic question. And to really get into it, we're going to look at a very specific, very telling case study.
Which is?
The European Union's initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, we'll focus on the early decisions, or maybe non-decisions, around air travel restrictions.
Ah, okay. Because the EU, with its 27 member states, it really fits that meta-organization model, but with sovereign nations as members.
Precisely. It's a great example of a governmental meta-organization facing a sudden global shock.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we've got sort of two parts. First, we need to get our heads around the built-in problems any meta-organization faces when trying to get members to act collectively.
Right, inherent challenges.
And then we'll take that framework and see how those challenges really played out with the EU and air travel right at the start of the pandemic. Sound good?
Sounds perfect. Let's start with the basics of meta-organizations.
Okay.
So the fundamental reason they exist is to achieve more together than the members could alone.
Makes sense. Strength in numbers.
Sort of. It's about coordination, sharing resources, maybe pushing for common goals, creating synergy,
But it can't be that simple. Where does it usually get messy? What are those friction points you mentioned?
Well, there are several built-in tensions. One big one is finding consensus. You've got diverse members, all with their own interests.
Right.
And balancing that need for agreement with the meta-organization's own capacity to, actually do something quickly.
Okay, consensus versus capability.
Exactly. Then there's the secretariat, the central staff. Their goals might not always perfectly match every single member's goals.
Agency problems, kind of.
A bit like that, yes.
Yeah.
And crucially, unlike your typical hierarchy, they often lack real teeth. There's usually no contract saying you must do this.
Ah, so members can just ignore them.
Yeah.
Or leave.
They can. They can leave. They can try to limit the meta-organization's power or, just ignore recommendations. It relies heavily on cooperation.
And I bet a crisis just throws gasoline on all those little fires.
All right.
The urgency, the different impacts.
Absolutely magnifies them. The need for speed, the fact that, say, a pandemic hits member A much harder than member B initially.
Yeah.
Plus maybe just not being prepared for that specific scenario. It makes collective action incredibly difficult.
So how do we analyze their influence then? What makes one potentially more effective than another?
The research we're drawing on points to a couple of things. Internal factors, for one.
Like what?
Like the resources it has, how specialized its tasks are, is it centralized or decentralized, and, really importantly, how cohesive are the members? Do they generally pull together?
Okay, so internal stuff matters, but not just that.
Right. External perceptions are huge, too. Its reputation, is it seen as legitimate by members in the outside world? What's its overall status?
Legitimacy and status.
Okay. And think about how resources get allocated. Often it's like a parliament, members vote. So members putting in the most resources, maybe money or personnel, they might be understandably hesitant to give up power or influence.
Yes, if you pay more, you want more say. That seems natural, if complicated.
It's a constant tension. And there's this interesting paradox with tasks. The Met organization needs to do things its members can't do alone.
That's why it exists, right?
Exactly. But those specialized tasks have to serve some bigger shared goal that everyone buys into. You need that system-level objective.
So it's an agent for the members, the principals.
That's the model. Ideally, the direction comes from the members up to the agent, building cohesion.
But ideally is the key word there, I guess. That flow isn't always smooth.
Far from it. There's always this underlying tug of war over autonomy. The meta-organization wants to be effective, but enforcing compliance. Very difficult. You can't just easily kick out a major member state, for example.
Right.
And then a crisis hits. Suddenly, members might prioritize their own survival, their own safe path over the collective good.
Like those hikers scattering in a storm.
That's a perfect analogy. It shatters cohesion right when you need it most.
And what about those symbolic things? Reputations, status?
They're built up slowly over time through shared wins, achieving goals together, but they can be damaged quickly.
How so?
Well, if the meta-organization strays too far from its original purpose, or if it just clearly fails to deliver in a major crisis, that reputation takes a hit.
Okay, that lays out the general landscape really well.
Yeah.
Now let's zoom in on the EU and COVID, specifically the air travel piece. Why is the EU such a good case here?
Well, even though the EU has supranational powers, some authority above the member states,
Which is unusual.
it is, but it still functions very much like a meta-organization. It's formally made up of 27 sovereign countries that agree through treaties to give it certain resources and powers.
And the European Commission in Brussels, that's like the Secretariat, the central staff.
Exactly like the Secretariat. Their job is to look out for the EU's overall interests, the supranational perspective.
Which might clash with individual national interests sometimes.
Often, yes. But the Commission isn't all-powerful. Its authority is limited to areas the members have actually delegated power. In some ways, that makes the EU weaker than a national government within its own borders.
Right, it can only do what it's allowed to do.
Precisely. And think about how its big goals evolved. Started with coal and steel.
Yeah, way back.
Then the common market, much later Schengen and free movement. These things grew incrementally over decades, building consensus, not overnight decisions.
So its ability to act fast in a crisis really depends on the authority and trust it's built up over time, both tangible resources and that symbolic status.
Absolutely. And on paper, the EU had a lot going for it. Treaty-based legitimacy, the Commission as a large bureaucracy, centralized power in some areas. It looked pretty well set to tackle a cross-border threat like COVID.
There's always a but.
But the research talks about actorhood. Can it act like a single unified player? Its actorhood is sometimes fuzzy. It doesn't have the monopoly on representation in every field, especially in sensitive areas like, say, public health emergencies early on. It often relies more on recommendations, guidelines, best practices.
Not hard laws.
Not always binding regulations, no. Think of it like a condo association. They manage the common areas, but they can't tell you how to arrange the furniture inside your own apartment. That's still your call.
Okay, that's a helpful analogy.
Yeah.
So let's get to the air travel specifics. We all remember those chaotic early months. What was the medical thinking on travel bans back then?
Well, the general medical view, even early in 2020, was that broad, consistently applied air travel restrictions could work as a delaying tactic.
Not a magic bullet to stop it, but to slow it down.
Exactly. To buy time.
Time for what?
Time for hospitals to get ready. Time to understand the virus better, maybe develop treatments or strategies. Buy breathing room.
But the EU didn't jump on that immediately.
No. There was a lag in recognizing the severity, or at least in acting collectively. Part of that seems tied to relying on the World Health Organization's early advice.
The WHO, another meta-organization.
Indeed. And in January-February 2020, the WHO was generally advising against broad travel bans. They argued they weren't that effective and could divert resources.
And the EU historically followed WHO pandemic plans.
Often, yes. The Commission had incorporated WHO guidance into its previous planning.
But hadn't the EU learned anything from, say, the swine flu back in 2009?
Well, the research mentions that. There was criticism then that restrictions came too late to make a difference.
So past experience was maybe ignored.
Or perhaps outweighed by other factors. A second huge issue with COVID was how uneven it hit initially.
Right. Italy and Spain got slammed early.
Exactly. While Northern Europe had much lower rates at first, that difference really undermined the feeling of a shared immediate threat needing a single EU-wide response.
And it clashed directly with Schengen, the free movement idea.
Totally. That principle is so core to the EU. So instead of a unified strategy, the EU became more of a coordinator for what individual nations were doing anyway.
So that window, that chance to slow the spread across the continent, it was missed.
It seems that way. Coordinated early restrictions, maybe focusing on travel from the hardest hit areas like Italy then, could potentially have bought significant time for other countries' health systems.
Is there evidence for that?
Research cited suggests a lot of early cases were imported via air travel. And stopping that by May 2020 would have required really dramatic restrictions.
But the Commission didn't push for harmonized rules until much later.
Not until September 2021, according to the source, well after that initial wave.
Which is kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the EU did have power over air travel, right? Open skies, the single market.
You nailed it. The legal and structural framework was absolutely there. They could have acted collectively on air transport.
But the political will wasn't there, especially against that core free movement principle.
That seems to be the crux of it. Plus, you can't ignore the massive economic hit.
The money. Airlines, tourism, national budgets.
Huge potential losses. Member states were understandably very hesitant to shut down a major economic engine, especially during a developing crisis.
Didn't they try to help airlines with vouchers instead of refunds?
Yes, there was a push from transport ministers around late April 2020 for that, showing just how big the economic concerns were.
But the lack of coordination might have actually hurt airlines more in the long run. All the changing rules.
Some analysis suggests exactly that. The constant uncertainty and patchwork of national rules might have been worse than a clear, early, unified lockdown, even if painful initially.
How did this compare to what, say, the U.S. was doing?
Well, the U.S., under Trump, acted unilaterally pretty early, banning travel from China in February 2020 than other places.
And the EU followed later.
The EU-wide ban came in March. The research hints, though, that maybe the EU was reluctant to just, follow the U.S. lead, national pride, or strategic differences, perhaps.
Interesting. And wasn't there some weird rule about airport slots?
Ah, yes, the 80-20 rule. Airlines had to use 80% of their allocated landing and takeoff slots to keep them for the next season.
So they had to fly near empty planes just to keep their spots.
That was the incentive, yes. It potentially worked against reducing travel. The UK and the Airports Council actually called for suspending that rule quite early on.
Because those slots are like gold dust at busy airports.
Extremely valuable, yes. Losing them is a major blow.
So it really wasn't a unified fortress. More like, as you said, lots of separate castles building walls at different times.
That captures it well. If you look at the original 6 EU members before the March 17th EU-wide ban, huge differences.
Italy acted fast out of necessity.
Understandably, yes. Very strict, very early. Others, like Germany, the Netherlands, were much slower to impose major restrictions.
And even after the EU ban, lifting the rules was messy too.
Completely uncoordinated, it seems. Different countries opened up at different speeds with different rules, quarantines, testing who was allowed in.
You had places like Greece opening early for tourism.
Right, while others kept borders tighter. Ireland had its green list, which caused some confusion. And then later, Germany closed some borders again in early 2021 due to variants, which actually drew criticism from the EU.
So the EU was often reacting, not leading, on this specific issue.
It appears the downward influence from the EU level to the member states on air travel specifics was pretty weak in that initial phase, more chasing national decisions than setting the agenda.
Wow, okay. That paints a very clear, if complex, picture. So what are the big takeaways here for how we understand these meta-organizations and maybe for how they should work in a crisis?
Well, theoretically, this really shines a light on a potential weak spot for meta-organizations, crisis effectiveness. It's maybe less studied than their day-to-day functioning.
Right.
And the EU's response, or the initial lack of one on travel, it kind of challenges theories that assume rational cost-benefit calculations would lead to swift action. The tools seem to be there.
The adaptive capacity, you called it.
Yes, but it wasn't mobilized effectively or quickly enough in this specific domain. The research argues it makes more sense if you see the EU acting like a meta-organization stuck on its pre-existing goals and consensus needs.
So the very thing that makes them work, normally consensus, shared goals, becomes a massive roadblock in a fast-moving crisis.
Exactly. Unless you have specific crisis plans already agreed upon, those consensus mechanisms can just be too slow, too cumbersome.
Especially, I guess, when the crisis forces you to potentially violate one of your core founding principles, like free movement for the EU.
That's a crucial point. Tackling a crisis by undermining your raison d'etre, that requires a huge, rapid shift in thinking and a plan for managing the internal conflict, which just wasn't there initially for this particular challenge.
So practically speaking, what's the lesson for other meta-orgs, especially governmental ones?
One key idea is maybe focus. In a crisis, focus on a few very specific, concrete actions where acting together clearly offers way more benefit than everyone doing their own thing.
Show the added value, clearly and quickly.
Precisely. And while planning for pandemics is hard because they evolve, you can plan for white swan events, things you know are possible, even if you don't know the exact details.
Foreseeable but unpredictable crises.
Exactly. The central staff, like the Commission for the EU, need contingency plans. They need to be ready to advise members based on past lessons and best practices. Crisis readiness needs to become a core goal itself.
Something everyone agrees on before the fire starts.
Yes. Get the buy-in beforehand. The Commission could really drive that preparedness culture shift.
And this obviously points towards areas needing more research, right?
Definitely. We need more studies on how meta-organizations, especially supranational ones like the EU, actually behave under crisis pressure. Bringing in political science insights on crisis decision-making would be valuable.
And looking inside the member organizations.
Yes. Understanding their internal dynamics could help figure out how to scale up collective responses better. Also, just cataloging the core goals of these international bodies and seeing how well they stick to them or what happens when they stray.
And setting realistic expectations for them.
Crucial. What can we reasonably expect them to achieve, given their structure, their founding documents, their members?
Now, the research is fair about its own limitations, isn't it?
It is. The authors mention it's mainly qualitative, not deep dives into specific closed-door meetings like some political science studies do. That detailed level might reveal more. And they're careful about judging decisions made with limited info during a crisis. It's easy to be wise after the event.
Hindsight is 20/20.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So focus on the process as much as the outcome, while still recognizing that some core principles should guide decisions even under pressure.
Okay, so summing up this deep dive, organizations of organizations, especially ones involving governments like the EU, face really unique, really significant hurdles in a fast-moving crisis, particularly when the crisis hits a core principle and when that specific type of crisis wasn't adequately planned for in terms of collective response.
That really captures the core finding. Even powerful-looking bodies can struggle when speed and unity are suddenly paramount, and the old rule book doesn't apply.
Which brings us right back to that listener question. Hopefully this gives you that aha moment, explaining why even a relatively integrated entity like the EU found coordinated action on something like air travel so challenging early on.
It's the inherent structure interacting with the specific crisis.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Our world's getting more connected, right? More transnational crises seem inevitable. So how can these meta-organizations change their stripes now? How can they build in the agility and scientific agreement consensus needed before the next crisis hits?
And what role do the individual members, the states themselves, need to play to actually make that happen? It requires commitment from both levels.
A crucial question for the future.